Hello everyone, and welcome to Nexus Tech HD. In today's video, we take you far from cities, far from modern infrastructure, and deep into a world where survival depends on skill, patience, and determination. This is not a story driven by advanced machines or cutting-edge technology. Instead, it is a story shaped by human effort, natural materials, and the quiet strength required to endure when resources are limited. Hidden deep within the forested highlands of Vietnam, life follows a different rhythm. Roads fade away, convenience disappears. What remains is land, weather, and the responsibility to adapt. In this environment, even the most basic need, shelter, must be earned through effort. This video follows the journey of a single mother living in isolation with her child, barely over 1 year old. There is no finished house waiting, no walls to block the wind, no roof to keep out heavy rain. Only dense forest, uneven ground, and the constant pressure of responsibility. In a place like this, every decision matters, because every decision affects not just survival, but safety. What would you do in this situation? Would you leave and search for help elsewhere? Would you wait and hope that assistance arrives? Or would you face the environment directly and begin building with what nature provides? There are no guarantees here, no instruction manuals, no second chances. The forest offers materials, but it also demands respect. Mistakes are costly, fatigue is constant, and time moves forward regardless of readiness. Yet necessity has a way of pushing people beyond hesitation. Faced with the reality of raising a young child without proper shelter, action becomes unavoidable. Waiting is no longer an option. Comfort is no longer the goal. Safety becomes the priority. Using nothing but bamboo harvested from the surrounding forest and palm leaves gathered by hand, a decision is made to build a stilt house from the ground up. Elevated above the earth to avoid moisture and insects, simple enough to construct alone, strong enough to withstand rain, wind, and time. This is not a project driven by ambition or recognition. It is driven by responsibility, by the need to create stability where none exists, and by the understanding that survival, in its most honest form, is built slowly. The first days were defined by uncertainty. There was no clear plan written on paper, no detailed blueprint to follow. Everything began with observation. The forest was studied carefully, not as scenery, but as a source of survival. Bamboo grew in clusters, tall and flexible, shaped by years of wind and rain. Palm trees stood farther away, their leaves broad and strong, capable of forming shelter if used correctly. Each morning began early, before the heat of the day settled in. Mist hovered low among the trees, and the ground remained damp underfoot. The child stayed close at all times, never far from reach. There was no separation between work and care. Every task was balanced against feeding, calming, and protecting a young life. Choosing bamboo was not a matter of convenience, it was necessity. Some stalks were too thin, unable to support weight. Others were too dry, prone to cracking. Selection required experience and patience. Each piece was cut by hand, measured by eye, and carried slowly back to the chosen site. Transporting materials alone demanded caution. Bamboo poles were long and awkward, forcing frequent pauses. Energy had to be conserved. There was no advantage in speed. The forest did not reward haste. It demanded awareness. The site for the house was chosen with intention. Slightly elevated ground offered natural drainage. Trees provided partial cover from wind and rain. The goal was not domination of the landscape, but coexistence with it. The house would need to belong to its environment to survive. Preparation of the ground came first. A stilt house could not rest directly on soil. Moisture, insects, and animals made that impossible. Bamboo posts were driven deep into the earth, one by one, spaced carefully to distribute weight evenly. Alignment was done by sight and experience. Each post had to be trusted. Progress during this stage was slow and largely invisible. From a distance, nothing appeared to change. But beneath the surface, stability was forming. This was the most critical phase, even though it offered the least immediate satisfaction. Rain arrived often, sometimes without warning. Sudden downpours turned soil into mud and slowed movement. Work paused, then resumed when conditions allowed. Adaptation became routine. The forest controlled the pace, not determination. As the vertical post settled, horizontal beams followed. Bamboo was tied together using natural bindings, each knot tightened with care. A loose connection could compromise the entire structure. Weight was tested repeatedly. Balance was checked constantly. Fatigue accumulated quietly. Hands grew rough, muscles ached. Small cuts appeared and healed slowly. There was no time for complaint. Physical discomfort became part of the daily rhythm. Despite exhaustion, attention never wavered from the child. Some days construction slowed to almost nothing because care took priority. These pauses were accepted without frustration. The purpose of the house was clear, and every decision flowed from that purpose. As the frame began to rise, the idea of shelter took physical form. Space was defined. Height mattered. Elevation offered protection not just from water but from danger. The house began to separate life from the ground below. Days passed into weeks. The forest changed with light and weather, but the structure remained steady. Confidence grew, not from optimism, but from repeated confirmation that effort produced results. The floor came next. Bamboo was split carefully and laid across the beams. Gaps were minimized. The surface needed to be strong, stable, and safe. This was not just a walking surface. It was a place where a child would crawl, stand, and eventually walk. Every slat was tested. Weak pieces were replaced. Nothing was assumed. Bamboo speaks whenever strained. Learning to listen prevented failure. Walls were woven from thin bamboo strips. This process demanded patience. Each pattern balanced airflow with protection. The house was not meant to seal itself off from the forest, but to exist within it. Wind was allowed to pass gently through, carrying heat away while keeping rain out. Night brought different challenges. The forest was never silent. Insects, distant animals, shifting leaves. Sleep remained light. Awareness stayed constant. Safety was something being built, not yet fully achieved. Food remained simple. Energy was rationed. Each task was weighed carefully against exhaustion. Overworking would risk injury. Rest became strategic rather than indulgent. The roof represented the greatest challenge. Palm leaves had to be gathered from farther distances, dried properly and layered with precision. Too thin and rain would penetrate. Too heavy and the structure would strain under weight. Working above the ground introduced risk. Balance became critical. One misstep could undo weeks of effort. Movement slowed. Focus sharpened. Fear existed, but preparation kept it contained. As the roof layers grew, shade formed beneath. Rain sounded different, softer, distant. For the first time, the space felt protective rather than exposed. This change was subtle but powerful. The structure was no longer just a project. It was becoming shelter. As the structure gained shape, the work demanded greater precision. Every decision now carried more weight, because mistakes at this stage would affect not just progress, but safety. The house was standing, but it still needed to prove itself against the environment that surrounded it. Rain tested the roof repeatedly. Sudden downpours struck without warning, drenching the forest in minutes. Water ran along the palm leaves, following the paths carefully designed by hand. When leaks appeared, they were addressed immediately. Leaves were adjusted, bindings tightened, layers reinforced. The roof was not finished until it could withstand the storm without compromise. Inside the house, attention shifted to usability. Space was limited, but it had to function efficiently. Movement paths were considered carefully. The floor needed to support weight evenly. Sharp edges were removed. Gaps were closed. Every detail was shaped with a child's safety in mind. The ladder became a critical element. It was the only connection between ground and shelter. Each rung was tested repeatedly. Stability mattered more than speed. A fall could undo months of effort in seconds. The ladder had to be trusted without hesitation. The forest continued to impose its presence. Wind moved through the trees with force. Branches shifted. Shadows changed constantly. The house remained still among them, not resisting nature, but working with it. Bamboo flexed slightly under pressure, absorbing movement rather than breaking. This flexibility became a strength. Fatigue deepened as days passed. Muscles carried the memory of effort. Hands bore marks of constant use. Small injuries were treated quickly to prevent infection. There was no margin for carelessness. Health was as critical as structure. Caring for the child remained the highest priority. Some days work slowed significantly when rest was needed. These moments were not seen as setbacks. They were part of the balance required to continue. The house existed for protection, not as a test of endurance. As weeks passed, the interior atmosphere changed. Wind softened. Rain sounded distant. Insects became less intrusive. The house began to offer predictability, something rare in an environment shaped by constant variables. Nighttime felt different inside the shelter. Elevated above the ground, awareness shifted from exposure to observation. Sounds were still present, but they no longer signaled immediate danger. Rest became deeper. Recovery became possible. The structure revealed its character. It leaned slightly in places. Patterns were uneven, but nothing felt unstable. The house was honest in its imperfections. It had been shaped by necessity, not aesthetics. As the final days approached, adjustments replaced construction, reinforcing joints, strengthening weak points, ensuring balance. The goal was no longer to build, but to secure what had been built. The house stood quietly among the trees, not dominant, not fragile, integrated. It belonged to the forest because it was made from it. What began as a response to urgency had become a foundation, not only for shelter, but for continuity, a place where daily life could exist without constant fear. The environment had not changed. The forest remained demanding, but within this structure, stability had been created, and stability changed everything. As the 90-day journey moved toward its final stretch, the work changed in nature. The urgency that once drove every action slowly gave way to observation. The house was no longer just being built, it was being lived in, tested by daily routines and quiet moments of rest. Mornings now began under a roof that held firm. Light filtered through woven bamboo walls, casting soft patterns across the floor. The air moved freely, cooling the interior without exposing it to rain or wind. These details were not accidental. They were the result of careful choices made under pressure. The child began to explore the space with growing confidence, crawling across the bamboo floor, sitting near the walls, watching shadows move, sleeping elevated above the cold ground. These small moments revealed the true purpose of the structure. Shelter was no longer an idea, it was a lived experience. There was no single moment that marked completion, no final piece placed with ceremony. Instead, the house gradually transitioned from project to presence. It simply became part of daily life, as essential as food and water. The forest continued to demand respect. Weather remained unpredictable. Resources remained limited. Life did not suddenly become easier, but something fundamental had shifted. Exposure had been replaced by protection. Uncertainty had been replaced by routine. Every joint in the structure carried memory. Every bamboo pole reflected effort. The house stood not because it was flawless, but because it was understood, built with awareness, maintained with attention, trusted through experience. At night, the sounds of the forest still surrounded the house. Insects moved, wind passed through the trees, distant animals announced their presence. But these sounds no longer carried the same weight. Elevated above the ground, inside walls shaped by intention, rest became possible. The house did not dominate its environment, it blended into it. Bamboo aged naturally, palm leaves weathered over time. The structure accepted change, just as life in the highlands demands acceptance. What began as a response to necessity had become a foundation for continuity. A place where daily life could unfold without constant fear. A place where care could replace urgency. 90 days earlier, there had been only uncertainty and exposure. Now there was structure, not just physical, but emotional. A sense of stability formed quietly, without announcement. This house did not promise comfort in the modern sense. It promised something more essential. Safety, reliability, the ability to face the forest without being consumed by it. And in an environment where survival depends on balance, that promise was enough. This story does not end with a completed structure, because real stories of resilience rarely end with a clear conclusion. They continue quietly, woven into daily routines, shaped by time, weather, and care. Deep within the forested highlands, A bamboo stilt house now stands, not as a monument, but as part of the land that gave it form. Built without machines, without modern materials, and without outside assistance, this shelter represents something fundamental. It reflects what human determination can achieve when options are limited and responsibility is unavoidable. Every bamboo pole carries the weight of effort. Every palm leaf layered on the roof speaks of patience. Nothing here was rushed. Nothing was unnecessary. This home was not created for recognition or display. It exists for protection, for stability, for the simple ability to rest without fear. In an environment where uncertainty is constant, that alone is an extraordinary achievement. The forest remains demanding. Rain will return. Wind will test the structure. Time will leave its mark on bamboo and leaves alike. Maintenance will be required. Adaptation will continue. But this house was built with understanding, not haste. It was shaped to bend rather than break, to age naturally rather than resist change. What this journey reveals is not just a method of construction, but a way of facing hardship. Progress here was not measured by speed or efficiency. It was measured by consistency, by the ability to continue when exhaustion became familiar, by the willingness to accept imperfection while protecting what mattered most. In a world increasingly defined by convenience and automation, stories like this remind us that technology is not the only path forward. Knowledge, patience, and respect for natural materials still hold power. Sometimes, the most meaningful innovations are rooted in tradition and necessity. This house stands as a quiet answer to a difficult question. What happens when there is no safety net? When waiting is no longer possible? The answer is not dramatic. It is deliberate, step by step, choice by choice. As seasons change and life continues in the forest, this shelter will remain a place of rest, protection, and continuity. Not because it is perfect, but because it was built with purpose. Thank you for watching Nexus Tech HD. If this story resonated with you, let it serve as a reminder that resilience often lives in the quietest places, and that even in the most remote corners of the world, determination